All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Like I said, this is Drew Grandy. I'm the Clean Energy Program Director with the Mass Climate Action Network, and proud to be co-presenting tonight with Alternatives for Community and Environment, also known as ACE. Richard Zhuang will be joining us a little bit later in the presentation. But first off, thank you, everyone, for joining. This is our third and final webinar in our legislative conversation series. Our first two covered clean energy, net zero, both building codes and in gateway communities, as well as transportation. And we're happy to be covering tonight our environmental justice and 100% clean energy for all. So our speakers tonight will be Senator Jamie Eldridge, Richard Zhuang of ACE, Rep. Michelle Dubois, Rep. Liz Miranda, and Representative Adrian Madaro. We will be doing a moderated Q&A at the end of the webinar tonight. If you have questions during the webinar, please type those into the chat group. My one request is please do not answer questions for each other. It does get a little bit distracting for people that are participating in the webinar, both in the chat and speaking here tonight. So we'll save all questions for the end. Everyone should be muted right now except for our speakers. If you are having trouble with audio, like I said in the chat group, please call into the number and pick up the audio through your phone that way. Do appreciate that. Like I said, we are recording the webinar. We will be putting it up on our YouTube channel and on our website under the past webinars tab. That should be up by tomorrow afternoon. And please take that, share it with your networks, share it with your other groups, and we're happy to have everyone on here. Mass Climate Action Network was founded in 2000, and we work to help town-level groups take action on climate locally. We have a network of 50 chapters that represent more than 75 cities and towns, and if you are not already a chapter, we are more than happy to welcome you to our local group and have you participate with us. Richard, are you online with us right now?
Yes, I am.
Richard, if you'd like to give an introduction for ACE, we're happy to have you on.
Sure. Thank you so much, Drew. Alternatives for Community Environment is one of the oldest person of color-led environmental justice organizations in Massachusetts. We're based primarily in Roxbury, which, as many of you know, is a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And our work has been at both local and state levels on environmental equity and now, more recently, on anti-displacement. And we have a great deal of skin in this game, so to speak, because we've been working on environmental justice issues for a long time. Most recently, probably the 2017 updates to the statewide environmental justice policy. It's an honor to be here among these leading legislators and with MCAN.
Thank you, Richard. As a reminder, our speakers tonight are Senator Jamie Eldridge, representing the Middlesex and Worcester District. Richard Zhuang, who we just heard of, ACE, he is a staff attorney with there and will be coming back in after Senator Eldridge. And also tonight, State Representative Adrian Madaro, State Rep. Liz Miranda, and State Rep. Michelle Dubois. And right now, I would like to reintroduce State Senator Jamie Eldridge to talk about his 100% renewable energy bill. So, Senator Eldridge, if you're on the line, we're happy to have you, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Drew. Great to be on here with Richard, Rep. Dubois, and Rep. Madaro. And thanks so much for MCAN and ACE for organizing this webinar. So I am the lead Senate sponsor of Senate 1958, an act transitioning Massachusetts to 100% renewable energy. It's a bill I filed last session. The House sponsors are Representative Marjorie Decker and Representative Sean Garbely. We have made the bill a bit bolder of saying that the Commonwealth must transition to 100% clean renewable energy by 2045 instead of 2050, in part given the UN climate report that came out recently talking about what a short window of time, really just 12 years for the world, for all countries to get it right on reversing climate change. And the bill itself is fairly straightforward in really the way that it's accomplished, and that's 100% renewable energy across all sectors by 2045. So that means, transportation, building, where, clearly we're not doing as well as we should compared to the electric grid or the delivery of power, and then 100% renewables in the electric sector by 2035. And what the bill does is it basically establishes requirement that all state agencies, must be working towards that 100% renewable energy goal, and establishes an administrative council for the clean energy transition. So this brings together all the major, energy offices, as well as, housing, health and human services, education, to all come together. So whether it's buildings, whether it's, programs that are happening in communities, whether it's various state laws, that they're all working in concert to get to this 100% renewable energy goal. The bill, again, is fairly straightforward, but it also, addresses the fact that, for example, municipal light plants, some are doing well, but others, rely far too much on fossil fuels. So pushing them to move to 100% renewable energy. It creates a clean energy workforce development fund, and it directs DOR to increase incentives to get us to that goal. I would say that there's a tremendous amount of organizing around the bill. The bill came to me from Environment Massachusetts and Ben Hellerstein, and there's been a tremendous amount of organizing, not just by elected officials, including legislators and municipal officials, but college campuses, other environmental organizations. It's a top priority of groups like Progressive Massachusetts and the Sierra Club. So I'm feeling very optimistic about it. A version of this bill was in the Senate Clean Energy Bill that passed last session. So I know myself and Representative Garbely and Representative Decker are working very hard to, get this across the finish line. I will say that, I think Governor Baker has really moved in a very positive direction on clean energy, given some of the bills he's filed around climate resiliency, and even proposing to, raise revenue to invest in climate resiliency. So, I think we're in a very good place, and really just need to make sure that when the House and Senate take up the major energy bill, I don't know when that is, but whether it's the fall or early next year, that it includes the 100% renewable energy goal. This is a goal that has now become law in Hawaii a few years ago, and then just this past year in California. So we're making some real progress, and happy to take questions later. And again, appreciate everybody's input into the bill, and happy to be on the call.
Thank you, Senator Eldridge. Appreciate your time for joining us here. If anyone on the webinar tonight does have questions about the bill, Senator Eldridge will be sticking around for the Q&A at the end. Just please type those into the chat room. Next up, Representative Adrian Madaro on House Bill 826, an act relative to environmental justice in the Commonwealth. And Representative Madaro, if you are online, we're ready for you.
Thank you, Drew. If you could just go to my first slide, please. Oh, first of all, Drew, Michelle, Liz, Jamie, all our other guests, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Despite being a 30-year-old millennial, believe it or not, this is my first ever webinar, so I'm very happy to be joining you, particularly on these great topics. And especially I want to give a shout out to Senator Eldridge, and thank you for your leadership, Jamie, on that 100% renewable bill. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the House version, and I do hope to see that get over the goal line this session. But now we will be transitioning to environmental justice. These are two bills I filed, both relative to environmental justice. And these were bills that I filed in consultation with Green Roots, an organization next door to me in Chelsea, as well as working with Gene Benson, former staff attorney for ACE. So it's great to be on the line with you, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I know there's wonderful folks working at ACE. Thank you for all you do there. And just to take a step back at kind of a macro view of how I got involved in environmental justice, These are issues that are very personal to my community and to my family. East Boston has long been an environmental justice community. For those of you who are unfamiliar with East Boston, we are home to Logan International Airport and all the burdens that come with it. So, you know, that my family in the early years was very involved in the community activism, fighting against airport expansion and other environmental injustices, and that's really what led me to being interested in environmental justice. The first bill, H826, right now sits in the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agricultural Committee. And my second one, H3374, which is really a civil rights bill at its core, sits in Judiciary. With that, Drew, if you could go to the next slide, we're going to review some definitions of environmental justice, just to familiarize everyone with the topic. I'll let you, read the definitions at your leisure. One I want to highlight, obviously, is the first one. What is environmental justice? What we refer to as EJ. Again, it's simply the right to be protected from environmental pollution and live a clean and healthy life, regardless of race, income, national origin, or English language proficiency. And at the core, it really guarantees equal protection for these issues. And the first environmental justice policy in Massachusetts was actually adopted in 2002, but it really only affected the Office of Environmental Affairs at the time. And it wasn't until 2017 that the Baker administration updated that definition, having EJ applied to many more, actually all state entities. However, to date, this definition has only been policy. It's actually never been codified into state law. So the definitions you see here, environmental justice, the environmental justice populations, what the burdens are, the benefits, these are all just policy. None of this is codified into law. And as you all know, once things are codified into law, it gives it more teeth. And so that's at the core what my first bill does. And the crux of environmental justice is to protect these vulnerable populations, like my constituents, who have historically been saddled with a disproportionate share of environmental burdens, and really to guarantee that access to clean and healthy living, and make sure that constituents like mine and others across the state who are in EJ communities have a voice and are really involved about the decisions concerning sites with possible environmental burdens. Really, environmental justice is where environment meets civil rights. And I want to dive into the definition of populations with a little more detail. Really, EJ populations are neighborhoods or portions of neighborhoods that are moderate to low income with a median household income of 65% of statewide median, or ones that have 25% or more minority or communities of color, or communities that have 25% or more households that lack English proficiency. So if you just take my community of East Boston, we pretty much fit every metric. Despite rapidly gentrifying, we continue to be a moderate to low income community. We are the immigrant town for the state and for the region of New England. We are 58% Latino, many of them recent immigrants from places like El Salvador and Colombia. We actually have a burgeoning group of North African Muslims, many Moroccans coming into the community. So we not only have a majority minority, but we also are predominantly immigrant. And of course, with that type of population, many households do not speak English as a first language. So on that population definition, the designation of an EJ population can be removed if the median income is 125% of the statewide average, if a majority of adults are over 25 or college educated, or if the neighborhood no longer has unfair environmental burdens and does not lack access to environmental benefits, which could be parks, waterfront access, etc. So that's at a really high level. And Drew, if you could shift to the next slide, I'm going to dive into some of these impacts in East Boston. Thank you, Drew. So this is a map of East Boston. What you see highlighted in red is what I want to start with, because as you will notice, it is almost half of my community. So Logan International Airport is in East Boston. Every year we read press releases about Logan breaking records for passengers served. And of course, the more passengers they serve, the more vehicles that are coming through our streets. And some of you may have seen recently, we received the dubious distinction of being the most congested city in America. East Boston really is ground zero for that congestion. Last year alone in 2018, we had 12 million TNC trips. TNCs, transit network companies, the fancy term for Ubers and Lyfts. 12 million of them to and from Logan Airport, cutting through neighborhood streets of East Boston. So Beyond the traffic, we have the airplanes and all that comes with it, the noise pollution, the air pollution, et cetera. So beyond traffic generated from Logan Airport, we also have 93, 90, and Route 1A all running through East Boston. So we certainly have an enormous share of environmental burdens from a pollution standpoint. Those highways, by the way, are highlighted in yellow, and then the orange circles I want to draw your attention to are petroleum storage facilities. My community houses the majority of heating fuel for the region, as well as all of the jet fuel for Logan Airport. All of these petroleum facilities discharge pollutants into Chelsea Creek, furthering those environmental burdens for my community. So needless to say, East Boston is not short on environmental burdens. These are the types of things that make my community an environmental justice community. I know you will hear from my colleagues in the House who will explain why their communities are EJ communities, because certainly the impacts are different. With that, I believe we can move on to the next slide. Thank you, Drew. So again, this is the first bill that I referenced, 826. It's my environmental justice bill. At the core, this codifies the definition of EJ and EJ populations into law. Again, to date, they have just been policy directives. This would put them into law. It also calls for, requires environmental impact reports, which would have an enhanced analysis of these impacts, right? And so the EIRs, environmental impact reports, they require description of project. They require all the potential environmental impacts and public health impacts to be listed based on construction and operation, as well as mitigation measures to be listed to minimize the environmental and health damages. And really, EIRs help us ID adverse consequences that cannot be avoided, and then to plan for reasonable alternatives to those consequences and potentially to that project. Enhanced analysis for EJ populations include analysis of air impacts, data on baseline public health in the affected populations, analysis of alternatives to reduce those impacts, and proposed on or off-site mitigation to decrease those impacts or introduce benefits that could offset those negative impacts. And lastly, I want to highlight the Supplemental Environmental Project Bank, SEP, which is the last bullet on this slide. The SEP will maintain a list of environmental benefit projects in EJ communities that can be funded with fees paid by violators. And what's unique about the SEP is that individual residents from those communities can actually propose projects to be considered. And again, these projects can help mitigate and offset some of those environmental burdens that these uses would have. Drew, next slide, please. This is the civil rights EJ bill that I filed, H 3374. Really, this was in response to what's known as the Sandoval decision. That's the second bullet here, which is a Supreme Court case in 2001 that prohibited the ability to sue based on disparate impact through Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Disparate impact, bringing your attention to the first bullet, are just practices that adversely impact or deny participation to people of certain protected characteristics. Historically, these have been race, color, national origin, gender, even though those rules are technically neutral. And so what I'm trying to do with this bill is actually give EJ communities standing with Title VI. It does not allow, communities in Massachusetts to sue the federal government or private companies because the Sandoval decision by the Supreme Court does still stand, but this would allow residents or groups to sue states and agencies of Massachusetts, for example, state entities who may be dealing with where I would say the process goes through these state agencies at the ground level. And this just gives residents one more opportunity to have standing and to get involved in the process. And the important thing to note is that disparate impact is often felt with regards to environmental decisions, and so it's really critical that folks have the opportunity to inject themselves into the process and have an opportunity to be heard, and for communities to have standing, particularly those communities that are environmental justice communities already. And the last thing I'll say is the unfortunate thing about EJ communities is it's not just the fact that they deal with existing environmental burdens. EJ communities tend to be communities where more environmental burdens come. So for example, in East Boston, they're trying to site a substation in my community. That has not been well received, as you can imagine. So this bill in particular would really give communities like East Boston and any other EJ communities the tools they need to deal with increased environmental burdens for communities that already deal with too many. So that's all I have for this evening. I look forward to answering any questions any of you have. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here tonight on my first webinar. Hope I did all right.
Thanks,
Great job.
Great job of that. And of course, if anyone does have questions for those two bills, please type those into the chat window. We'll be able to get to those in the end. We're going to come back to Richard in a few minutes. First, I want to get to introduce State Representative Liz Miranda. And Liz, if you are with us, we are ready for you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm State Rep Miranda, affectionately known as Lizzie. I'm really excited to be here. Unlike Adrian, I do a lot of webinars. I really want to give a shout-out first to you, Drew, MCAN, to ACE. I'm from Roxbury, born and raised, so I know a lot about that organization and have to publicly thank you and all of your partners for what you've done to really revitalize and support my community. I grew up in the Dudley Triangle, so an EJ neighborhood that there's 2 movies about and a book called Streets of Hope because of the environmental injustice that we faced in that community. And I just want to say I'm happy to be on here with Michelle Dubois, and we're going to actually go through the slides together. So I was really excited about signing on to this bill when I got to the State House because of the 5th Suffolk District of Roxbury and Dorchester, which I will legislate from, is a community that is 94% of color. It is the largest minority, quotation mark, district in the Commonwealth. It is 50% foreign born. We have a 36% poverty rate, a 20% unemployment rate, and I won't even get into the other factors like gun violence that is happening in our community. And I personally believe that all of this stems from being in an unhealthy environment. We have a lot of noise pollution and air pollution. We have a 30-year drop in life expectancy from Dudley Square, which is down the street from my district, to Beacon Street. We have 5 times a higher asthma rate. And so I really feel that like a lot of the things that are happening to our district has been about decades of environmental injustice. So welcome. Thank you for offering me this opportunity.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing more from you, and I think we're also right now going to introduce Rep. Dubois, also a co-sponsor on House Bill 761. So Rep. Dubois, if you're with us, we're ready for you as well.
I sure am. Hi, Drew, and thank you for hosting this and allowing me to be on here with you. This is my first webinar as well, so I'm happy to be here. I'm going to kick right in. So I grew up knowing what disparate impact meant in Brockton because my mom and I and the community stopped the tire burning facility that they wanted to put in a residential neighborhood when I was 12. And then way back in 2003, we utilized the environmental justice policy as a community group to get the first ever negative site assignment, along with a lot of activism and advocacy from the DEP. So when I got elected to city council, my goal was to protect the environment because I cared about these things. I stayed there for 5 terms, 10 years, and I'm in my 3rd term at the State House. And when I arrived and the environmental justice policy had become an executive order under DeVal Patrick, I was looking around to see what actions had come on it, and there weren't any. So just like Representative Madero said, promulgating this into law and to mass general law was critical for me. So this is the 3rd time that I filed some version of this bill, and Senator Eldridge has been the House sponsor each time, so I'm grateful to him. And so we're going to kick right into this. It's a comprehensive structure for environmental justice in the Commonwealth that will give protections that are practical and make us a very strong state for environmental justice. So in Section 1 of our bill, we're going to go back and forth with each section. It just lays out our goal, which is to eliminate disparities with respect to exposure to environmental toxins and implement Article 97 of the Constitution, which provides that all people should have the right to clean air and water. So, Drew, if you'd go to the next slide, please. So then in Section 2, we have a bunch of definitions, and one is environmental justice, and it's defined exactly the same way as in Rep. Madero's bill. And in the bottom of this slide, it shows the other definitions that are included in this section. So you can go to the next slide, please. So Section 3. Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry. No, it's okay. On this slide, it's about forming an Environmental Justice Advisory Council. You can jump in, Michelle, and ensuring that there's a reporting schedule. We really understand that there needs to be an independent sort of advice and voice that can give recommendations to the governor, the secretary of EEA, about the broad cross-cutting issues related to environmental justice and on policies. And right now, it's supposed to consist of between 9 and 15 people, 2 appointed by the Senate President, 2 by the Speaker of the House, the Governor, and then 4 members of the Advisory Council. And what's really, I think, important in this, besides having a council that's independent, is that having this council actually report within 6 months of is important. I know for me, when I got to the State House and I haven't had the expertise of some of my colleagues, it was clear that the voice about saving the planet and the environment was really missing an environmental justice lens, which means a lens of people of color and poor people and immigrant communities. And I wanted to make sure that this was a part of that plan. We can also go to the next slide. Requires the Department of Environment Protection to develop and implement an EJ strategy for prioritizing enforcement in EJ neighborhoods. We know that this is happening all over the Commonwealth, and we know that this needs to be done immediately and requires them to submit an annual report detailing the number and types of enforcement actions that are actually happening in EJ neighborhoods. We find that in a lot of EJ neighborhoods, particularly if there's a word I learned today, English isolation, that what's hard for them is that they're getting polluted on, these things are happening, but they're not also being able to voice their concerns or don't feel listened to when they're sharing these concerns that are ultimately killing us as a community. Part of that EJ strategy, you'll see a couple notes here, 1 to 4, but establishing a process for reviewing which MEPA thresholds apply for enhanced public participation, substantive review, ensuring brownfield remediation in or near EJ neighborhoods, and an online EJ repository of information. Go to the next slide, and Michelle will take back from over there.
So now we're back at another element that our bill, the Environmental Justice Act, and Adrian Madero's bill share, which is a requirement for there to be a seed bank. It would be a wonderful way. So many wealthy individuals that run corporations that get penalties for polluting, they invest those penalty dollars right in their own neighborhoods, which is great if you live in the neighborhood of a multimillionaire who runs a polluting business. But it's not so great for cities like Brockton, where they don't even know that where our brownfields are, what the projects are that they can clean up, how they can help with the communities that are most in need. So this will go a long way to help people understand that there are other places to invest these penalty dollars for pollution. And I'm ready for the next slide. So the next one is it requires the Secretary of EEA to publish a report on environmental justice. So they have to talk about what type of seed bank activities have been undertaken, so the public knows. Report on metrics for pollution in neighborhoods with environmental justice populations, and outlining further policy actions. So really holding the Secretary of EEA accountable, and he has to do this every 5 years. So then they'll always be cognizant in creating that structure so we can have a clean environment in low-income communities of color and people that have English isolation. Representative Malia is next.
Miranda,
not Mariah, sorry.
I get it all the time. So I have Section 7 and 8, and part of Section 7 is that the Department of Public Health will establish a health risk assessment guidelines, and so we're encouraging collaboration, what a novelty, that the Department of Environmental Protection work with DPH to basically develop an online tool that will share the harmful effects to human health or to ecological systems, basically from each area of pollution, and then develop an online mapping tool that is accessible to the public, hopefully multilingual, and identifies our EJ populations by their census tract. We want to list the sources of pollution. As Adrian kind of mentioned, in these communities, we often have multiple pollutants. And then we are driven by sort of the need for people to continue to try to pollute us. So I think this will be incredibly important because often our communities don't even know that they have multiple environmental injustices happening at the same time. And then identifying the harmful effects to human health and ecological systems resulting from the exposure from the different pollution source. We're going to try to make them prioritize the census tracts with the worst health risks, and hopefully develop strategies for reducing these public health threats. And then Section 8, really, these are the sections where there's a lot of similarity, or they are similar in both bills, which is great. And Section 8 just talks about some MIPA definitions. Michelle, it's you.
Okay, great. So I'll take the next slide, please. So now I'm going to close out. Section 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. 16 isn't listed. All kind of play together. Section 12 is a little different in that what it does is it requires to limit the number of toxic release inventory facilities within environmental justice communities. This is a federal definition that requires certain polluting industries or waste companies to report to the federal government the different types of chemicals that are released or that are used on their property. And this section requires them to come up with a strategy to limit the number that are cited in environmental justice communities and limit the expansion of them. Section 13, 14, 15, and 16 play together. So 13 requires the director of environmental justice at the EEA, and it requires that position not be vacant for more than 60 days because we have had an executive order on the books that would require a director of environmental justice at EEA, and that has been vacant for a heck of a long time. Last session, we were able to get money in the budget to fund that, and the position still wasn't filled. Section 14 requires every single secretariat to have an EJ coordinator. So I've met with all the secretariats last session, and every single one of them didn't really have a problem with it. They wouldn't have to hire a new person. They would be designating a person. Maybe DPH said they may want to hire a person to do that because it's a little bit more in-depth with what we want from DPH. And then Section 15 requires every single secretariat to come up with policies and strategies around environmental justice within their purview. And then it's not here, but Section 16 creates an interagency environmental justice working group where the Director of Environmental Justice at EEA will meet with the EJ coordinators in each secretariat to come up with methods to move environmental justice forward in the Commonwealth. And that is it.
Great. Thank you, Rep. Dubois and Rep. Miranda. I appreciate both of you. And if anyone has any questions on these two bills, please take advantage of the chat function that's inside there. We're going to be getting to the Q&A here very shortly. One thing I do want to go back to is Richard Wong from ACE. Richard, if you're on, I apologize for skipping over you earlier, but we're ready to get back to you now.
Yes, thank you so much. First, let me check. You can hear me?
Yes.
Great. First, thank you, MCAN and Senator Eldridge, Rep. Dubois, Rep. Miranda, and Rep. Madaro. These were fantastically detailed presentations and extremely valuable. I don't have much to add because I think the Q&A session is vitally important, but I will say that it is fantastic that all of you have stepped up to the plate as essentially civil rights champions. Because the reality is we are in a moment when civil rights are under attack from across the board under the Trump administration, and environmental justice, as well as, I think, the fight for renewable energy, are facets of a broad civil rights struggle. Environmental justice, I think, we can really start thinking about it as the logical intersection of the long-running movement for racial civil rights meeting up with the fight for environmental protection. So it's the logical intersection of two very important movements. The clustering of pollution that we've seen in places like East Boston and Brockton is not coincidental. Those are outgrowths of long histories of environmental racism, of environmental classism, and of the segregation of communities more generally. The role that these bills have to play now, I think, is to really break that cycle of environmental racism and classism, and to find remedies and solutions to existing patterns of environmental racism and environmental classism. Finally, I think the thing that comes to mind is that where this connects up to climate change is that the same principles that apply to dealing with environmental justice in terms of pollution should apply to the distribution of benefits from climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So those communities that have been most vulnerable to pollution will also be the most severely impacted by the consequences of climate change, ranging from more severe storms to flooding. And similarly, the mitigation efforts that we put forth as a state or as a nation should prioritize, I think, those communities that have historically and continue to be most vulnerable: low-income communities, communities of color, communities without English language proficiency. That being said, I'd like to turn this webinar then over to participants and questions and answers, and I'm happy to be on and answer questions as best I can.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate your patience with me of getting you back into the rotation here. We do have a couple questions in the chat room right now, and I think the first one from earlier in the night is directed towards Senator Eldridge. If you're here with us, we had a question about the role of nuclear power and how that plays into your bill for 100% clean energy. If you can talk about that.
Yes, nuclear power is not considered a renewable energy in the bill, so it would not apply. You know, I think there's just growing evidence not only of the hazards of nuclear power, but actually, you know, even to build a nuclear power plant requires a lot of carbon emissions just to build the facility, and I think it's safe to say, you know, given what happened in Japan recently related to climate change and how that impacted one of their nuclear reactors, and also just the number of years in government financing it would take to build more nuclear power in Massachusetts and the rest of the country. I don't really see nuclear power as viable. You know, we're seeing states like Hawaii and California that have passed the 100% renewable energy bill. I think it's possible here in Massachusetts. You've got, you know, real burgeoning offshore winds. You've got, you know, more solar coming online. You've got things like energy efficiency. So I think it's possible to get to 100% renewable energy without without nuclear power.
Thank you, Senator. Richard, I think we have a question here that probably best directed towards you, and it's around organizing, working with elected leaders both in the community and also their state representatives. And the question is from Kim, who is in a environmental justice community, but her concern is that the community itself is fairly conservative, and a lot of people in town are skeptical of state regulation. Talk a little bit from your experience of organizing what some of the best tactics would be to help move some of these bills forward in a community like that.
Well, I'd like to actually defer to Rep. Dubois for this question, because I think she has much better insights on this, especially coming out of Brockton, than I do. What I would like to do is field the compressor station question about Weymouth.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. Rep. Dubois, if you want to help us out with answering this question about helping move
well,
forward
I hope I can help Tim.
local
I know
support.
that for me, environmental justice regulations came into play because my community wasn't able to participate in a full and active role like you need to in order to stop petitions for polluting industries in your community, because we don't have a lawyer in every block. We don't have engineers in our neighborhoods that will understand these complicated applications and help you. We don't have the financial wherewithal to hire attorneys. So what, in a nutshell, what Environmental Justice Act does is it puts the hands and power into the community in ways that the person can understand. So it allows information about the pollutants to be put up in the front end. They don't have to wait so long. It requires these impact reports at the front end. It requires that the notifications be published in languages that are spoken in the community in their newspapers. It gives extra time for those communities to organize and to come up with a strategy. As an example, the first transfer station that was permitted in Brockton that I'm talking about was construction and demolition debris, and the permitting process just went beyond we didn't know until the last day you could submit an appeal, and it didn't work out for us. And then when they wanted to expand to garbage, we were able to utilize the Environmental Justice Act to get more time, which allowed us to find ACE, Alternative Community Environment, who gave us free legal advice, as well as Toxic Action Center. So what it really does is it's similar to we give subsidies for electric vehicles, and I support that, but no one in my community can afford a electric vehicle no matter how much you subsidize it. But what we can do is if you give the regulations a little bit of a twist, so it provides us more time and more information, we can stop the 350 megawatt natural gas power plant that's got a 15-year permit and still is being fought in Brockton. But we need a little help. And by stopping that power plant, we're going to stop a lot of the toxics that everybody breathes.
Great. Thank you, Rep. So Richard, back to you on the Weymouth compressor station question of, hey, if these bills were laws at the time that Weymouth was proposed, how would that process have gone differently?
Yeah, it's probably useful to recognize that Weymouth is a very important case study that's in some ways still unfolding. One of the things that folks should know on the call, well, first off, the Weymouth compressor station issue refers to a natural gas compressor station that is sited for, I believe it's near the Fore River, and adjacent to more than one environmentally overburdened community. As a consequence of both federal law and compliance with state law, the proponents of the station have been able to move the project pretty far ahead, despite pretty substantial community objection. What one finds looking at the Weymouth situation is that the proponents essentially were making the argument that their regulatory statutory compliance entitled them to cite the compressor station where it was adjacent to already overburdened communities. The regulators were more or less of the position that such compliance did entitle them to build the compressor station. So the voice of the community went largely unheard. However, the Weymouth activists are fantastic. They're an amazing group. And they put enough political pressure onto the governor so that the governor did, in fact, have what's called a health impact assessment performed. Unfortunately, the health impact assessment, well, it seemed to find that there would be no adverse health impact, and that's being contested right now. But what the situation showed was that there is an important role for community voices, but those community voices need to have some kind of statutory forum to be heard. There needs to be a mechanism in law, not just simply at the discretion of the regulators or the governor for community input. The other thing that becomes visible in the case is that, to my mind, is that there needs to be legislative guidance and a legislative mandate for regulators to side with communities and with the protection of public health. The reality, as was mentioned earlier, is that the environmental justice policy is a policy which does have the force of law to some extent, but nothing really beats a clear statutory, let's say, legislative mandate for the protection of environmental justice communities and for community participation in environmental decision making. So, does that answer the question?
Yep. Thank you, Richard. Rep. Miranda, we have a question here. You were talking about tracking data at sensor track level instead of block group. Can you go into any details on that one as to why the census tract data is more effective than any other information, any other information or data that's out there?
Michelle, help me here because I'm just new to this. But one of the things we were thinking about, I heard a quote this morning about sort of linking toxic pollution to race, race and demographical data can often show us where folks are located in certain communities. We understand that in some cases there are neighborhoods within different census tracts that are more deeply impacted. So I believe that that's why we chose to go forward with that type of data.
Great, thank you.
I would just add that, you know, it's a living document, and so it was chosen to do by census tract to collect the information that way. But I think it's open for discussion. Just my opinion there.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got 3 minutes left here. Before we finish off with the last question, I do want to point out we do have 2 resources for everybody as far as fact sheets and 1 or 2 pages on these bills. Those 2 sources are on the Mass Power Forward website, mapowerforward.com, and also on the legislative page on the MCAN website as well, which is up on the screen right now. Last question, if we can go around to each of our presenters here. We've been getting some questions about what can people on this webinar do to organize and help move these bills forward. I think these are definitely topics that are close to home for everyone. So if we go around, Rep. Madaro, what would be most helpful to move your bills forward? I think you might be on mute right now. So, Miranda, if you want to jump in with what you see.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, there you go.
I was on mute talking to myself.
Go ahead.
You want me to go ahead? All right, sorry about that.
Please.
But I think the most effective thing folks can do, reach out to your state legislators. Call your state reps, call your state senators, encourage them to support the bills we've been talking about tonight, because that's, where we're at in the legislative process. We need support. These are going to all have public hearings. They haven't had public hearings yet. We want legislators there supporting our bills, and we want you there supporting our bills. So stay in touch. I'm sure Drew can help keep folks informed about when these bills are having hearings, et cetera. And we would welcome you to come testify and show your support. And if you can't come in person, send us written testimony. But without a doubt, reach out to your state legislators and encourage them to support the bills we've been discussing. That's probably the most effective way to move the needle on these things.
Great. Rep. Miranda, your take? Most effective thing that's needed most?
Well, co-sign and double snap that. But one thing that I really believe in is, at 13, I was taught a lot about environmental injustice, and I was living in the midst of it and didn't know. And so I believe in power to the people. And I would love the support of the organizations or the partners here to actually do more community forums. I've been talking a lot to Michelle that I speak fluent Cape Verdean Creole, and I'm willing to work with Cape Verdean associations both here in Dorchester and Brockton to hold a forum in these communities to really empower the people to say, hey, you don't have to deal with this. You deserve better. And I believe that also puts a lot of political pressure when there is people that are inspired and empowered and know that their voice matters. So that would be my suggestion, in addition to putting pressure to the legislature, because I believe that, particularly being an African American woman and a woman from an immigrant family, when I was talking about environmental justice, I had so many inboxes of people who inboxed me online who said if I hadn't did my story with NBC, that they would have never known that we had a 30-year drop in life expectancy based on public health data. And I think we need to educate our people more so that they can help fight with us.
Thank you. Rep. Dubois.
I'll take Representative Miranda's help with the community forum. Thank you very much. And I agree with everything that the former reps have just said. So I think they covered it for me.
Great. And Senator Eldridge?
Yes, thank you, Drew. And really great conversation, and appreciate all the other presentations on their legislation. I would really say, and especially I'm the lead Senate sponsor with Rep. Dubois on one of the environmental justice bills, is that I really think we need to hear more stories from across the state about the impact of having a contaminated community or neighborhood, because I think with some of our colleagues that maybe aren't as focused on environmental justice or renewable energy, there's sometimes a sense that these aren't issues in Massachusetts. So I think we need to hear more stories from community groups. On the renewable energy front, I've really seen the power, I think we all have, of young people. One of my constituents is one of the co-founders of the Sunrise Movement, which has been doing amazing work all across the country, including in D.C., really getting young people to tell their stories, because for them, in many ways, climate change is an existential challenge that could is likely to change their lives forever. So getting them to talk more about their stories and how climate change impacts people, really moves people a lot, as we've seen it on a whole host of other issues.
Thank you. Richard, your final take?
Yeah. At the risk of sounding like I'm doing a pitch, I'd say join MCAN, join ACE, join any environmental organization that integrates environmental justice into its support of climate change, renewable energy, and any environmental issue. I think look for those intersections, join up with the organizations, because those organizations are translating individual separate voices into coherent pushes and policy positions.
Great. Thank you very much. Couldn't have said it better than any of you. Thank you to all of our speakers, Senator Eldridge, Representative Madaro, Rep. Miranda, and Rep. Dubois, and Richard Zhuang from ACE for joining us tonight. And thank you, everyone, for participating in our Legislative Conversations web series. And this was just the beginning. Please take action. Make sure the information you learned on any of these webinars doesn't just stay here with you tonight, but use this to move forward and continue on to making all of these bills law for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. See you soon.
Bye now.